When we started out in the design process and set the framework of stipulations for the area that we now call the Withermark, one of the things we decided was that there should have been a barrier preventing access to the region, and that the barrier came down in recent memory. And now a little bit later on in the process, after going through the design process as outlined by Worlds Without Number, we understand that the barrier was in fact not the calamity of evildoers that we initially thought it might have been, but there was a twist to it. The barrier had a purpose, and that purpose was to keep something out. Something that is still undefined, something that is a threat to the entire world that the Withermark finds itself in. And that of course means we'll have to get to the bottom of what that threat is. But first we have some more setup work to do. We need more content for our region. We need more geographical features, and we need some factions. So let's get to work. Hello friends, Anderson here. This is Worlds Without Number, building a world using the system as outlined in the core book that is, by the way, available for free, but there's also, of course, a paid version that has a little bit more content. We're still very early on. We have a lot of work to do to set up and flesh out the rough outline of our region before we start on any detailing and connecting the dots. And first and foremost, that means geographical features need to be generated. We already have our mountain range that still needs a name, but we need 5 more if we want to fulfill the task as provided by Worlds Without Number. First off, though, the additions from the comments section. The input that I received was voluminous, but not all was applicable to the design process right now. So I am already squirreling away some things for later use when we get to the point in the process where some of the feedback that you've provided me with is more apt. I already did that in the episode before last as well, but there is still a lot that we can go over from the comments. And speaking of which, of course, comments, likes, subscriptions to follow along with the series, all of that is much appreciated and helps, and is in fact essential for the built-in back and forth that we have here. So thank you very much for continuing to do that. So as for your input, you also had some thoughts on the mountain ruins we generated when fleshing out the border mountain range, and what the investigation of our scheming wizards that we also rolled up through the historical event actually, well, how they actually link up, how they combine, and what the reasoning behind them is. And there were really 2 schools of thought that pertain to those ruins. One is that the ruins themselves are somehow related to the greater evil that the barrier is trying to keep out, and that the wizards are sealing off the ruins to prevent the re-emergence or maybe even the discovery of what that evil is and what its true nature is. The alternative school of thought was that it could also be a power source or some other part of actually creating the barrier, or a summoning spot where the ice wraiths or the frost elementals were unleashed upon the world, or maybe even a location containing an ancient mechanism the wizards found and leveraged, which of course throws out another potential historical faction, or maybe even links us up with the old empire of the north that we assume existed at some point. Both are extremely fitting and valid alternatives that we, I think, can only pinpoint once we know more about our world, about our history. So we'll keep it in mind, and we're not yet at the point where we need to take that fork in the road. For now, they're both things we can just roll with, depending on which way the dice swing. Now, as for the nature of the evil that was kept out by the barrier, presumably, one suggestion was that it might have been the thing that caused the downfall of the old northern, potentially even elven empire, and that it might in fact even have been summoned by the inhabitants of that empire, perhaps as a powerful warding creature or force that got out of control and turned out to be the greater evil compared to whatever it was that they were trying to stave off at the time. That, I think, is also a very interesting scenario. And again, we don't know enough about the world yet to really make that decision. But I think if we have the opportunity to take that piece of the puzzle and slot it in when building our history and thinking more about the Northern Empire, we will do so. Regarding planes of existence, we got the Elric approach thrown at us, which basically means there should be maybe a plane of law and a plane of chaos as the originator for both flavors, with the physical realm as the battleground in between, which would limit the amount of planes of existence we have to work with. And I like that. I also like to extrapolate a little bit from that, which might also be an explanation why the outright in-your-face supernatural or explicit fireball throwing wizard isn't a thing in this world. And that is that maybe the physical plane and its denizens grew tired of being the battleground and found a way to, again, going with the theme of barriers, seal the influence, the direct influence of those supernatural planes of existence away from the physical world, and that therefore the manifestation of influence from those planes of existence can only be indirect unless the barriers come down again, which of course might be one of the threats that we deal with, might be one of the threats that the wizards were in fact trying to stave off, or at least somehow related to it, we don't know yet. But it's certainly a design element that we can work with, and that could also help us to answer maybe a question about religion, because thinking about how would you go about sealing yourself off from metaphysical planes of existence, maybe that involves a foundation for religion. Maybe it was a god or a creature that is considered a god that helped put this in place. So as far as metaphysics go, there might actually be an entity that keeps the doors locked, and that is therefore perceived as the one true deity that we're working with. We will get to the regional, or rather the deities relevant to our region a bit later on in the process, not too far off. So we can maybe pick up on that again, depending on which way we want to swing with this. Monotheism is one of the themes that I would like to go for, at least when it comes to fleshing out our empire. So that might well rear its head again, where this is basically also a monotheism that thrives on anti-wizardry, anti-witchcraft, and heavily ritualizes and sanctions that. It's an option. Now, we already touched upon empires, additional empires, and that there's not necessarily a need to counterbalance our existing empire, but that there may well be room for one if it fulfills certain stipulations. For example, that it cannot be directly involved, that it is either far, far away or has some other reason, like isolationism, for why it doesn't actively participate in world events. And while I didn't really think it was necessary to have it, it's still kind of cool to have it. So I think we do have room in our world for a looming, inscrutable, isolationist power that nobody really understands, nobody really interacts with, and that nobody really comes back from. And that is somehow out there, and that could help us generate some sort of, I don't know, Deus Ex Machina for future events in our world. If we do play out scenarios in the world and there is some direct threat from whatever evil power is out there, perhaps this wild card could play a part. So I like putting it in there. Let's keep it in mind. We definitely have the space for it, and it's a cool concept. Now, the name of the world. We need a name, and you have supplied a few ideas, and I have come up with one single one of my own. And those are the 4 choices we have here. We have world, which is effectively an old English anglicized spelling of pre-modern English version of the word. We have weird, or weird, which is a good band, but also a cool word. I came up with Ert, which is effectively a combination of my native language and my native dialect combined into a single word, which is erde and ed. And a bit of an outlier, we have umbra, which I also like. It has some reminiscent touches for me for Werewolf the Apocalypse, but that is not at all a bad thing. So let's leave it to the dice again. I have a d4 here to make the decision for me. I win! Not that it was a competition, but it's at least my proposal. So we go with Ert, which I think is a good word fitting to the theme we're going for with Withermark and with the English dictionary. And that was it for the additions from the comments section. We can now move on to the design process of Worlds Without Number and enter back into the one-roll terrain features here. But before we do that, we need to figure out what kind of a feature we're generating, and for that we have a D20 significant terrain feature chart that we're gonna roll on before that. So here goes our second feature. What is it? I roll a 2, which makes it an Aratu Wasteland. That is, I think, something specific to the world building that comes with Worlds Without Number, but it's of course easily adapted. Well, I say easily, we'll have to think about it a bit. The stipulation here is that it is a area that was once xenoformed by outsiders. So I'm thinking in our diction, in our understanding of how world and metaphysics work, considering maybe going with the law and chaos, it might be some area that is a remnant or maybe even a weakened barrier zone where one of the forces manifests in the physical, and that is therefore dangerous and inhospitable. Another option, of course, is that it is one of the areas that gives us a bit more of a clue with regards to our greater evil out there. So it might be something where that force manifests and might give us a first clue what that force is. I think before we settle for an option, we just generate the feature details. Maybe they give us a clue. So we throw all our dice in one basket and see what we get. Our D4 result, how populated is the feature, tells us it is almost unpopulated. That makes a lot of sense if it is inhospitable. The D6 results, how dangerous is the feature, is a, wow, 6. Okay, the dice are playing along today. I like it. It is a death zone for all but the strongest. That also makes sense. That is also our second death zone. So I think in terms of making our world grim and perilous, we are well on our way. The D8, what use is this feature? Now this is where it gets interesting. What result do we get there? A 1. A rare and precious resource is found there. Now what could that be? That's of course an interesting concept. If it is, for instance, a planar residue, some kind of condensed chaos or condensed law, which might make for an even more interesting twist where, you know, the first thought would always be it's a very chaotic and demonic zone, but what if it isn't? What if it is the plane of law bleeding in, and we have to design horror around the rigidity and the implacability of law in there instead? Which so far does very little to say what the resource actually is, but we know now that in conjunction with whatever force is out there, whether it's law, chaos, or the greater evil, or whether the greater evil is one of the two planes, it manifests in a rare and precious resource, which is very nice. Moving on to our D10, what kind of event happened there? Our die roll says 5, a major nest of bandits or raiders formed. That is odd. Well, not necessarily odd, it just needs a permutation, I think. So in the widest sense, raiders could also be simply a hostile set of creatures that foray forth from that zone, but perhaps they can't exist in the world as is outside of the zone that is more connected to their plane of origin or whatever manifestation of a great evil they are. And so they always have to return there. So especially if it's a terrain feature that we put a bit farther away, that it cannot immediately be accessed or overlap with our settled region, perhaps it's one of those mystic places where maybe even more the residents, the original native inhabitants of the zone know about it, and they get raided by it. All of a sudden starting to think about the movie Prey now, where it's like the native peoples get messed around with a bunch of like alien predators. And it could be something like that. So raiders in the widest sense, bandits, I don't think so. So raiders, yes, Xeno type, outsider, demonic, or maybe even lawful forces. It's the police. Something will have to flesh out eventually. D12, what antagonists are common there? Now, let's see. We get a 3 that makes it locals who resent interloping outsiders. So I think that kind of confirms there is a type of creature that is tied to the source of origin for whatever warps this zone, and it's not very friendly. It's kind of weird. I'm already starting in my head to think of them as the predators and moving it into that kind of cultural distinction now, where I'm thinking of them as some kind of a super predator type that only exists to hunt and kill, which could be interesting. Too early to say. We'll keep it in mind. It might, for instance, also be a manifestation of the grunt forces of the greater evil that is just left over there from some prior event, or maybe some altercation with the Northern Empire. So my gut says we're moving it fairly far north, maybe even out of the frame border of the immediate wither mark, but it has a bearing on the events there, and particularly on the native peoples, whoever they may be. We'll get to that in the faction design. D20, what optional quirk does the feature have? The die result is a 9, and that is, it has human-worked vistas of beauty. I think it's the capital of the old empire, of the Northern Empire. It's where the downfall happened, where the Chaos Gate opened, or where the great evil manifested and tore down, and where, even though now it got pushed back and reabsorbed to no longer warp the entire zone, this is where it was strongest, this is where it remains the most. And the juxtaposition is that the ruins of the capital, of the old capital, still are there. So we have this warped, twilight illuminated field of delicate, intricate ruins, and we have the super predators, the dangerous, greater evil. I think I'm sensing that now, that stalks them. And maybe only the natives know about it, know where it is, and maybe they're even trying to keep it contained and anyone from entering there. So I'm giving it the working title, The Old Capital, and we're gonna, in our minds, place it somewhere on the fringes, and we will give it a proper place once we know a bit more about the overall layout and the additional features. Maybe we can find some nice complicating factor, another terrain feature that makes it harder to access, and we'll sync them up somehow. So we'll figure that out a bit later. But as far as this goes, the old wasted capital that is now a horrendous wasteland associated with the greater threat that the barrier was supposed to keep out, that makes a lot of sense. Now, what other feature do we have? 18, Swamp. A sinking river, lake margin, or wet coastal delta forms a vast bog in this flat land. That could actually be helpful as a barrier, sort of an intraversible hindrance keeping our southern new arrivals from easily making their way farther north. So again, I'm thinking in the direction of the north when I think about the placement. Whether true north or northeast or northwest remains to be seen. But let's give it some details. How populated is it? 4. A rush of people have gone there, so it is very populated. Is this perhaps where some of the cultures native to this area have retreated when the barrier came up, or when the withering struck, the disease that depopulated the once settled province that now turned into a withermark. I think that makes a lot of sense to consider, because we do need our native peoples to have some terrain advantage as well. And if they know those bogs, and maybe there are bogs surrounded by forests. I'm now thinking about the whole Varus battle, Teutoburg, like Roman versus Germanic tribes encounter, where they were lured into the bogs, and the Germanic tribes did have the terrain advantage. That could be a thing where we put our native peoples in this boggy terrain. And by the way, I'm not thinking about like the natives as some kind of monolithic, undifferentiated set of peoples, but rather one aspect, one part of whatever native ancestries exist here went there. They might be human because we're building something human-centric. They might not be. That's for us to figure out a little bit further down the line. D6, how dangerous is this feature? Well, the question is for whom? The die says 2, which is there is one notable kind of danger there. Well, from the perspective of the southern settlers or imperial forces, I guess the one danger is those pesky natives. So that could actually also link up nicely. And of course, more than one danger is there if it's a swamp, but I think this goes a bit above the general background noise of hostile wildlife and the dangers posed by the intraversable terrain, and is aimed more at a consistent, story-relevant pillar of danger, like whether there is like one main important antagonist in the region. And I think if we make that our native peoples that rushed there when things went awry, that makes a lot of sense. D8, what use is a swamp? Well, our die result says it's a 4. Controlling it has military significance. Yes, so this is the natural border. This is perhaps the southernmost region that the perhaps former inhabitants of the plains of the Withermark fled through, and then further north. But the military significance is that whatever the border culture is that exists there, whatever native culture exists there on the border in the swampland surrounded by the woods, they're the ones that hold the choke point that prevents access to whatever is farther to the north, prevents access to the ruins of the Northern Empire, to the heartland, to the old capital. So I note it down as it's a choke point for northern expansion. D10, what kind of event happened there? Our dice say it's an 8. Some grim and terrible thing was awoken. I don't know what to make of this. I'd like to put it in context of the next result, which is what antagonists are common there. So let's take a sneak peek. 3, locals who resent interloping outsiders. Okay, it doesn't help. It just confirms the tribal or native or whatever cultural association we want to project on there. I'm thinking tribal in a sense of a very wide spectrum, from clans to nomads to any sort of expression of the term you can think of. But that doesn't help us with the grim thing that was awoken. I'm thinking in terms of story dynamic, it might be interesting if the tribal or local natives there in that swamp region had a problem with something on the inside. Some creature, set of creatures, some force that creates instability in their land, and all of a sudden they are vulnerable. Maybe they're not even able to manage on their own. Maybe it's an inter-native conflict as well with the adjacent culture or association farther to the north that tries to bleed in south and tries to get closer to maybe where the raiding pickings are. Perhaps the people that are currently in the swamp are isolationists and just try to keep others out, whereas the coalition to the north wants to actually actively engage and raid to the south, and they have created something, some problem for the inhabitants of our swampland, which could then create an interesting incentive for them to maybe make some concessions against their better judgment to the settlers or the forces of the empire, the expeditionary forces that are there, and makes them open to be exploited. I think for now that is more of a potential set of scenarios than a definitive one. So we just mark for later use that there is a grim danger in our swamplands that we still need to do something with. But I'd like to flesh out the factions and a bit of the history first to get a better understanding of what it could be, what awakened it, and whether there's some inter-native conflict as well. D20 optional quirk of the feature, our die result is a 19, which is, it's riddled with caves and delvings. Okay, caves and delvings in a swamp? That needs some interpretation. I don't really have a good idea. Does it mean that the locals there live underground? Or how do we interpret the... Because it has a subterranean aspect, which in a swampland kind of makes the least amount of sense to me, at least from my understanding. I think I'll pitch that one to you because I can't come up with anything off the top of my head and I want to kind of get a move on and generate one more terrain feature. So I'll put it to you. If you have an idea what the delvings, the caves for the swamp carry in terms of implication, what it could be, leave a comment. I'll pick up on it and we'll flesh it out next time. On to the next one. 17. Scrub Desert. These often appear on the leeward side of mountain ranges. Borders will often be grasslands or savanna. We have a mountain range, that shouldn't be a problem. So this might also be the immediate surroundings, or rather the area leading up to the spot that our hub city is located in. Or maybe it's the border region to the area that we place our orc confederacy into. Let's give it some details and see what the dice tell us, and maybe that sheds some light on the whole thing. I see another die 6 with a 6 on it. It's getting dangerous out there. How populated? D2. D4 result is a 2. That means very few settlers or workers there. And that is because D6 says it is a death zone for all but the strongest. So sounds like it could be both the extension of our perilous mountain range. Sounds like it could also be the border region for our orc tribal area or orc civilization area. Who knows whether they're tribes? Maybe they're like something completely different because we need a twist for some of those things. We'll see. For now, not conclusive yet, we just know very dangerous, not that many people. What uses the feature? Die 8. 3. It's sacred land to a group or religion. Now that throws it all in disarray, unless it's sacred to the orcs somehow. This needs more input from later on in the process, so I'm looping some notation there to this feature saying it needs to be fleshed out once we have groups, once we have religions. But of course, now it's more likely to swing in the direction of border area of orcs rather than mountain range. D10, what kind of event has happened here? That is a 10. A natural or uncanny disaster struck here. Maybe it wasn't a scrub desert to begin with, but it is another knock-on effect of the barrier, the calamity. And it was turned into a scrub desert, which made somebody really, really sad because it's very important to their religion. Now it's open again to everything. Could even be related to the dwarfs. Let me quickly move the D10 and the D20 and the D12 that we haven't interpreted yet out of the dice tray here, because I want to ask a 50-50 question, which is 50 and below. This was already a scrubland desert when disaster struck, and there is a different kind of disaster. And 51 and above, the disaster turned it into a scrubland desert. Okay, it's a 0-8, which means it already was a scrubland that was of religious importance to somebody, and then an uncanny disaster. I think we're gonna go with uncanny struck. Let me put the dice back in here and read them out so maybe we can get some more ideas on what happened here. The die 12 antagonist. Raiders and bandits are driven into the area. Are driven into the area. Now, that kind of links up nicely with my original concept for this orc land, where I thought that since I don't want to fall into this trope of the orcs are evil by default, perhaps the violent element, the unruly element of orc society is pushed into this area and then turns to raiding and banditry, either as kind of a trial period, almost like you're pushed out of your family, out of your tribal association, out of your society, whatever orc society is here, to go to the old ways. I'm thinking almost like in a sense that I think Genghis Khan said, where he stipulated that his descendants should go back to the steppes and live the harsh life on the steppes, because they would otherwise forget what it's like to be a true Mongol, to lose their edge, to get complacent and become like the people they conquered, like the Churchen or something like that. So that could be a thing that the orcs do on purpose, where it's almost a rite of passage to go into this religiously important step. And now, of course, maybe there is a complication because some uncanny force is at play there that came up when the withering came up, when the barrier went up, and they have to deal with that. So leaning strongly towards orcs now, and that the ones that are the bandits and raiders that are driven in there are actually there on either a rite of passage or they're outcasts from their parental society. So is it banishment? Is it a rite of passage? We don't know, but it is the reason why there are like orc raids without the necessity of saying they just do this because they're orcs and they're all evil, which is stupid. Die 20 result, the quirk is an 11. A significant part of it is subterranean. Okay, we are getting pushed underground here. So first we have the swampy caves and now we have a significant subterranean part. So it could of course be contested. And it could be that the uncanniness has something to do with who contests it. So what if there is a subterranean element of a subterranean people that are also in that region, that are also drawn towards the surface, and that also hold the surface to be of some kind of importance? We need to also figure out what it is there actually in that region on the surface that gives it this sacred status. But perhaps there's like another group, a subterranean group, that is in competition with our orc exiles, our orc pilgrim, our orc banished. Maybe it's underground orcs. Like maybe there's a schism in the orc history that makes it so there is, instead of having like elves and drow in this world, it's like orcs and dorks, or the dark orcs, I don't know, whatever it is. Not dorks. That might be something to consider. So it's like, perhaps there is an element there that is related to this uncanny event, was warped and twisted in some way, and has retreated underground. Maybe they don't stand the sunlight, but at night they come out and they fight with their former brethren or whatever it is. And of course the outsiders, the settlers, they don't understand this. They just lump all the orcs in as ones, like the evil ones, the good ones, the honorable ones, and it's just orcs kill on sight. They're all bad. That might make it potentially interesting, because again it gives us a little hook for potential cooperation between factions, which I feel like it at least should be there. As grim as the world design is, there should always be a potential for hope, for pulling together, even though it rarely ever happens, because every initiative gets twisted by greed or by other negative influences. So I would like for there to be pressure, internal pressure, on almost all of the factions, which could galvanize them into cooperation. Perhaps is even a task for a hero or group of heroes, anti-heroes, grimdark protagonists, whatever you want to call them, to make that happen. So what's the uncanny disaster? Are there warped subterranean orcs that are kind of the drow equivalent of the upstairs orcs? I don't know. Let me know in the comments. This is one of those where I think I want to go in that direction, but I could also use some input, so feel free to throw it out there. And I think looking at the clock, that does it for today. We have generated some additional features. We have 2 more to go, and then we can turn to the factions, and we do that next time. So thank you very much for watching. Thanks for participating. Catch you next time. Bye for now.